Hi there, my name is Liam McCullough, and for today's topic we'll be discussing the reality of women's sport, the current inequalities that exist, why they exist, and what we can do to help fix them. There are multiple discrepancies in how women's and men's sport are perceived, the most notable being the differences in pay and participation from men's sport to women's sport. Let's use the WNBA as an example. In the WNBA, women are paid around 20% of the revenue shared within their league, whereas NBA players receive around 50% of shared revenue within their league. I think most of us can agree that's not great. But let's take a deeper look into those numbers and see why they exist. Taking a look at the facts, famously, Adam Silver, commissioner of the NBA, has been quoted as saying, "The WNBA has lost an average of $10 million every year it has existed." This means that the WNBA only manages to scrape by as the NBA's massive profit subsidizes the WNBA's loss. Now, the pay disparity begins to make some sense as the NBA can only subsidize so much, leaving the WNBA short of some major funds to even begin to pay their players the same percentage as the NBA. So the question becomes, what can we do? What is the problem? Why does the WNBA not earn nearly as much as the NBA? A big reason is the fact that women in sport are not covered in the media nearly as much as men are. Now, this lack of coverage gives ammo to those that would say that the WNBA doesn't generate nearly enough interest, when in fact it is more likely that the lack of coverage informs the lack of interest in the WNBA. This lack of coverage then informs a whole host of problems, including viewing figures, attendance, funding, young adult development, sponsorships, and brand deals. So, we've established two things, right? That the lack of interest in the WNBA is why the media doesn't cover it, and because of that, it lacks interest. It's a very chicken and the egg problem, isn't it? So what came first, the chicken or the egg? Let's begin with the egg, this being the lack of interest in women's sports. Now, while there are multiple possible explanations for this lack of interest, the one that I'm particularly interested in is history, or the lack thereof to be precise. If you look back in history, most women's professional sports began to become more widely adopted during the 1980s and 1990s. Within this period is when the WNBA was started. When you take a look at the NBA, MLB, and NFL for the first 21 seasons, the same amount of time the WNBA has existed, you begin to see some more parallel between the leagues' stage of development, making what we see today in the WNBA not unusual. Now, one researcher suggests that a lack of familiarity is what makes such a distinct difference between the leagues today. Let me explain. The NCAA, in comparison to the WNBA, draws in a much larger audience. This suggests that schools that have a rich history of alumni and fans of that school will root for the school because, well, they're familiar to them. However, take any of the same players on that women's NCAA team and put them on the WNBA team, and casual fans are presented with a problem. This tends to be that the WNBA teams are not too familiar. They lack a certain history in comparison to the NCAA, which has been around for decades. A problem all too familiar with the NBA in 1970 when they were first just getting started. The chicken. This representing the lack of media coverage. Could be caused by a number of issues, however I want to home in on this one. Feminist theories suggest that sports were basically gendered, this coming from a time when men and women were not provided equal opportunity as they are now, meaning sports is predominantly dominated by men and still is today due to the historical impact of that inequality. The only impact of this inequality from a strictly sports perspective is the delayed starting of women's sports leagues. However, despite the increased popularity, participation, and rapid growth of women's sports league in recent years, women's sport is constantly diminished and silenced. Even with some instances of major organizations supporting in sexually objectifying ways, making women the targets of crude jokes, putting an overall devaluation on women's sports. So, we established that when women are covered, more often than not, it is to be targets of crude sexual conduct. However, this implies that women's sports get covered much at all. In a study from 2013, it is stated that the coverage of women's sport is the lowest it has ever been, reinforcing the idea that sports is for men, and women are nothing more than spectators. This definitely does not follow the same trajectory as the beginnings of men's sport, and through the lens of feminist theory, it is safe to say that media coverage of women's sport is ripe with sexism and misogynistic coverage. So, what came first? Chicken or the egg? Depends on who you ask, but if you ask me, I'd say it's a unique and complicated blend of both issues. Therefore, governments need to work to fight against both issues in order to see any marked improvement. One change that may help in the development of women's sport is a slow rework of how sports media today portrays women's sport and who doesn't. Careful selection of women sports reporters and commentators should be considered with a chance to give women the chance to commentate on their own sport, as there is evidence to suggest that these women are less likely to cover any women's sport in a disrespectful or misogynistic way. The other side of this coin is a lot harder to address directly and requires a bit more of a cultural shift. A part of it is that we just need to let history play out and let women create brand new amazing sports moments. But again, it is just as important that we cover those moments in the media for a brand new generation of women to see and be inspired by, creating a legacy for women's sports. I'm Liam McCullough, and thank you for listening to me today.